In this gripping story, Xavier Shaw, a successful black businessman, returns to his hometown of Millbrooke, only to face a deeply prejudiced police officer, Officer Daniels. Despite Xavier's status and accomplishments, Daniels harasses him, treating him with disdain and making racist assumptions based on his race and appearance. As the tension escalates, Xavier is humiliated and belittled, forced to confront not just an individual's racism, but the systemic biases entrenched in the town. This powerful narrative sheds light on the harsh realities of racism in America and the struggle for dignity and justice. Xavier Shaw could have easily walked past the corner cafe unnoticed. A tall, handsome man in his late 30s with a clean suit, leather shoes that gleamed under the light of the setting sun, and a look of quiet confidence that seemed to demand respect. He was a black CEO of a successful tech company, a venture capitalist who had built an empire from the ground up, a man who had studied at Ivy League schools, who had addressed investors in skyscrapers, and who had a private jet to carry him from meeting to meeting. But today, there was none of that towering presence that many would associate with a man of his stature. Today, he stood at the door of the same local diner he had walked past every morning since his childhood. He paused for a brief moment, surveying the scene before entering. It was early evening, and the diner was busy with its usual crowd. Locals eating their meals, the buzz of idle chatter filling the room. The scent of fried food and strong coffee hung in the air. Xavier had always liked this place. It was a reminder of simpler times, before the tech world had swallowed him whole. Back when he was just a kid with dreams too big for his small-town upbringing, sitting here with his friends, talking about life and what they hoped to accomplish. It felt like home. But as Xavier stepped inside, something felt off. There was a subtle tension in the air, the kind of unease that one could only notice if they were paying attention. It was as if the room's energy shifted slightly upon his entrance, as if a few pairs of eyes lingered just a little too long. Not hostile, but curious, and in some cases, dismissive. It wasn't the first time Xavier had felt it, but it always stung just the same. He'd been coming to this diner for years, even after the success of his company. The place hadn't changed much, neither had the people. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betsy, recognized him immediately. Her eyes softened with warmth, a smile spreading across her face. "Good evening, Mr. Shaw, same as usual?" she asked, motioning to his regular booth by the window, a spot he'd claimed years ago when he was just starting out. It was the perfect place. Quiet, with a view of the street, and far enough from the entrance to avoid too many distractions. Xavier smiled politely. "Yes, Betsy, thank you. I'll have the usual." She nodded, moving to grab his coffee, and Xavier took a moment to look around. The small-town atmosphere was comforting, yet stifling at times. He had gone from the kid who couldn't wait to leave to the adult who could never quite shake the feeling that he didn't fully belong here anymore. Even now, with all his accomplishments, there was always a small part of him that felt like an outsider. It wasn't because he had changed, but because things here had never really changed, and sometimes that made him feel like he was walking between two worlds, the one that had shaped him and the one that now demanded more of him than he was willing to give. He slid into his booth, setting his briefcase down beside him. Betsy returned with his coffee, placing it in front of him with a smile. "Your food will be right out, Mr. Shaw," she said kindly. Xavier nodded and smiled back. She was genuine, and for that, he was grateful. But even in this small moment of comfort, he couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching him. The elderly man at the counter was staring at him, a quizzical expression on his face. The group of young men in the corner were whispering amongst themselves, eyes darting in his direction, as though they were unsure whether to recognize him for who he was. And then there were the subtle comments, spoken just loud enough for him to hear, but not so overt that anyone would take real notice. "Wonder what he's doing in here," a man in a plaid shirt mumbled to his companion, his eyes narrowing as Xavier glanced over. Xavier's jaw clenched, but he stayed calm, focusing instead on the chipped ceramic cup in front of him. He had long learned to ignore the whispers and the sideways glances. There was no use in reacting. He wasn't here for approval. Still, the small-town mindset always managed to creep in, reminding him that no matter how many companies he built, no matter how many million-dollar deals he closed, there would always be someone who saw him first and foremost as the black guy in the suit. The waitress returned with his food, eggs, toast, and bacon, just the way he liked it. He thanked her, and took a deep breath before beginning to eat. But before he could take his first bite, a man approached his table. The man was in his early 40s, wearing a simple work shirt, dark jeans, and a baseball cap that read, "America's Best." There was something about him, his stance, his casual aggression, that set Xavier on edge. "You Xavier Shaw?" the man asked, his tone a bit too casual. Xavier looked up, surprised. "Yes, I am, and you are?" The man smirked, stepping a little too close. "Name's Thomas. I hear you're some big-shot tech CEO now. How's the world of the rich and famous treating you?" Xavier's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm just a businessman, like anyone else." Thomas laughed, clearly unconvinced. "Businessman, huh? Seems to me you're just another one of those types who thinks they can buy their way into everything." Xavier's heart rate picked up a little, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "Yeah, well, we all know people like you. You get rich, make it big, and forget where you come from," Thomas continued, a sneer forming on his face. "You think you can just waltz into this town and ignore the people who've been here working for years, struggling to make ends meet. What do you know about that, huh?" Xavier's stomach tightened. He had dealt with this before. The feeling that no matter how much success he achieved, there were always people ready to tear him down for being black, for having what they couldn't. But Xavier was tired of letting that control his narrative. "I know plenty about struggle," Xavier said evenly, maintaining eye contact. "I built my business from the ground up, no handouts, no special treatment, just hard work and perseverance. I haven't forgotten where I came from." Thomas scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Sure, but you probably don't care about the little people now. You probably don't even recognize the real struggles of people who've worked here their whole lives, right?" Xavier's patience thinned, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I'm here to enjoy a quiet meal, Thomas. I'm not here to argue. If you don't mind, I'd like to be left alone." Thomas didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture aggressive, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't just ignore the fact that you're not welcome here. You don't belong here, and neither does your fancy tech company." Xavier could feel the eyes of the room on him now, the quiet whispers, the judgment. He wasn't sure if they were watching to see if he'd rise to the bait, or if they were waiting for him to show them that he didn't belong either. But something in him snapped, something deep within, that reminded him that he was more than the assumptions others held about him. Without saying another word, Xavier stood up from the booth, his movements slow but purposeful. He towered over Thomas, who looked up at him with growing tension in his eyes. "I've earned my place in this world, Thomas, and you won't take that away from me." For a long moment, the two men stood there, locked in a stare that felt like it might explode into something more. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. But Xavier didn't move. He didn't need to. Finally, Thomas backed away, the sneer gone, replaced with something else. Fear. He turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Xavier sat back down, taking a deep breath, letting the tension of the moment slip away. The waitress, Betsy, returned, her face sympathetic. "You okay, Mr. Shaw?" Xavier nodded, a quiet smile on his face. Just another day in the life. But as he took his first bite of his meal, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, small as it was the beginning of something much larger. The world may not have changed, but maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand how to change it. Xavier Shaw sat back down, his food now cooling on the plate, the remnants of his meal seemingly forgotten. The encounter with Thomas, though brief, had rattled something deep within him. It wasn't the first time he'd been confronted with prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last, but it had always stung, even in the smallest of ways. In a small town like this, it felt like people wanted to put him back in a box, one that didn't fit who he was anymore. As he took another sip of his coffee, he felt the weight of the stares upon him once more. The whispering had died down, but it was still there, like a low hum in the background, just loud enough for him to hear, but not loud enough to confront directly. The discomfort was palpable. People weren't sure what to make of him. A black man, wealthy and powerful, sitting at their little diner, breaking bread like he was one of them. In their minds, he shouldn't be here. They were used to seeing people like him only on TV screens or in boardrooms, far from their small-town lives. Just then, the bell above the door chimed, and a new figure entered. Someone Xavier recognized from his years in this town. Officer Daniels. The young white cop, fresh out of the academy, and always trying to make a name for himself. Daniels had a reputation. His arrogance was evident in the way he held himself, as though his badge granted him an unlimited license to do whatever he wanted. He had made more than one person uncomfortable in the past, and though people avoided confrontation, they whispered behind his back. Today, however, Daniels seemed intent on putting his stamp on the world with Xavier as his canvas. "Mr. Shaw," Daniels greeted him as he approached the table, his tone more forceful than polite. "I didn't expect to see you in here. What's a big shot like you doing in a place like this?" Xavier froze, the insult hanging in the air like a bitter aftertaste. He knew what Daniels was implying. The subtle assumption that someone of his status should only be seen in places far more upscale, far more appropriate for a man of his wealth. He fought the urge to reply sharply, knowing it wouldn't serve him well. Instead, he managed a small, tight smile. "Just enjoying a quiet meal, officer." "Is there a problem?" Daniels smirked, leaning in a little too close, his eyes scanning Xavier as though searching for something to criticize, something to discredit him. "No problem," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just funny to see you here, no offense, but I thought people with your, status don't really mingle with the folks around here." Xavier's jaw clenched. The subtle digs at his background were so typical of people like Daniels, people who could never fathom that a man like him could achieve anything without some form of handout or luck. Daniels didn't see Xavier's hard work or his years of sacrifice. To him, Xavier was just another black man who had somehow, by some odd miracle, ended up at the top. He hated that, but he knew he couldn't allow his anger to show. "I've lived here most of my life, officer," Xavier said, his voice calm, though his eyes narrowed. "I still enjoy the same simple things, good food and good people." Daniels snorted, his eyes scanning Xavier's attire, his crisp suit, his polished shoes, his expensive watch, each item a marker of success. The officer's gaze lingered on the watch, his lips curling into a subtle sneer. "Right. Of course," Daniels said. "I suppose you have the right to walk around in the same places as everyone else, but you're a long way from home, aren't you?" Xavier's pulse quickened. His blood began to simmer beneath his calm exterior. He could feel the heat of Daniels' condescension, and though Xavier had learned over the years to suppress his emotions, there was something in this man's tone that struck a raw nerve. This wasn't just about a wealthy black man being in a small-town diner. It was about power. It was about Daniels' deep, underlying belief that men like Xavier didn't belong, that they hadn't earned their place, and it was all wrapped up in that sly, condescending smile. "I'm just here for a meal, officer," Xavier said again, more firmly this time. He could feel his body tense, the familiar anger creeping into his chest, but he willed himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time. "Is that a crime?" Daniels smirked again. "Not yet. But it's good to know that even someone like you remembers his roots. Just don't get too comfortable, okay?" Xavier's grip on the coffee cup tightened. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of the judgment. He was used to this, used to feeling like the world was watching, judging, expecting him to falter. But Xavier Shaw had built his empire not by buckling under pressure, but by facing it head-on, every day. This was no different. He stood slowly, not wanting to escalate the situation, but unwilling to back down. Either he was done with the games, the humiliation, the subtle barbs, the assumptions. They had all come to a head in this moment. "Is there something else you need, Officer Daniels?" Xavier asked, his voice calm, but now laced with quiet authority. "Because if not, I'd like to continue my meal." Daniels bristled at the words, the challenge in them clear. He had expected Xavier to cower, to shrink under the weight of his badge. Instead, Xavier stood tall, his presence filling the room with a quiet defiance. It wasn't something Daniels was accustomed to. He wasn't used to people of Xavier's stature pushing back. "Listen, Shaw," Daniels began, his voice a little more forceful now. You might think you've made it, but in my eyes, you're just another black man trying to play with the big boys. But I see through you. I know exactly who you are." Xavier's breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening around his cane. It wasn't just the insult, it was the clear, unspoken implication. Daniels didn't care about what Xavier had built. He didn't care about his hard work, his accomplishments, his success. To Daniels, Xavier was just another black man trying to fit into a world that wasn't made for him, and that was enough to warrant his disrespect. "Who I am," Xavier said quietly, his voice steady, "is someone who's worked harder than you can imagine. I didn't come here to prove anything to you or anyone else." The room seemed to quiet, the murmurs fading as the tension escalated. People had been watching, but now they were all waiting. What would happen next? Would Xavier take a stand, or would he let Daniels continue his verbal assault? Daniels stood still for a moment, clearly not sure how to respond to Xavier's composed defiance. Then, with a sneer, he took a step back and made a show of turning away, as if dismissing Xavier entirely. "Whatever," Daniels muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Just don't expect me to roll out the welcome mat." Xavier let out a quiet breath, his muscles still tense, but his mind racing. The conversation was over, for now. But the way Daniels had spoken to him, the way he dismissed his entire existence with just a few words, it stung. It always stung. The waitress, Betsy, came over once more, this time her eyes filled with sympathy. "Are you okay, Mr. Shaw?" she asked softly, her voice low so only he could hear. Xavier nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm fine, Betsy. Just another day in the life." But as she walked away, Xavier couldn't help but feel that the weight of this moment was far from over. Daniel's words had landed, but they had also sparked something within him. A quiet resolve. He had dealt with bigotry before, and this wouldn't be the last time he faced it. But this time, it felt different. Something about the confrontation, about how casually Daniels had tried to dismiss him, had ignited a fire inside Xavier that hadn't been there before. He couldn't just let it go. Not this time. The door chimed again, but this time, it wasn't Daniels stepping back inside. It was someone else, someone whose presence immediately commanded attention. Xavier turned his head, just in time to see a tall figure in a sharp suit approach the counter. The man's sharp eyes scanned the room briefly, before his gaze locked on Xavier. His posture was deliberate, and as he made his way to the booth across from Xavier, Xavier felt a sudden shift in the air, like something important was about to happen. Xavier Shaw's eyes narrowed as the man in the suit, tall and confident, approached him. The moment felt like a pause in time, the tension hanging thick in the air. Every step the man took seemed to intensify the anticipation in the diner. It wasn't just the suit or the sharpness in his stride. It was the way he held himself, like he knew the weight of the world and how to use it. Xavier had spent his life building something hard-earned, something that not many people in his town could understand. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be anyone's idea of a token success story for what black men could achieve. But here he was, sitting in this small diner, facing a man who could change everything, either for better or worse. The man paused at the counter and briefly exchanged a few words with Betsy, the waitress, before locking eyes with Xavier. His gaze was steady, like he was sizing him up, trying to gauge who this man really was. "Mr. Shaw," the stranger's voice rang out, deep and assured. "I'm Charles Graham. We need to talk." Xavier didn't respond immediately. He studied the man, noting the hint of authority in his tone and the way he carried himself. This was no ordinary passerby. He was either someone who could make life very difficult, or someone who could shift the scales in his favor. "What's this about?" Xavier asked, his voice steady, yet there was a flicker of curiosity underneath. He had learned not to trust too easily, especially in situations like this. Graham's smile remained tight, but not without some level of sympathy. "I've been following the situation here. I understand you're a local businessman, and I'm not here to cause any trouble," Graham said, settling into the booth across from Xavier without waiting for an invitation. "But I believe the issue you're facing is more than just one bad cop. It's something deeper, something systemic." Xavier's mind immediately went to Officer Daniels. The tension between them had escalated quickly, but now, with this new player in the game, He could see the pieces beginning to move in ways he couldn't predict. "I don't know what you mean," Xavier replied, leaning back in the booth. His hand subconsciously brushed the cuff of his sleeve as he thought about the confrontation. "I've had my fair share of moments with people like Daniels, but I handle things on my terms." Charles Graham's eyes softened slightly, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his voice. "I'm not here to lecture you, but you don't know this town like I do. The system here is rigged, Xavier. I'm a lawyer, and I've seen what happens when people like you or me step outside the boundaries they've set for us. Daniels is a symptom of a much larger problem. But if we don't fight back, if we don't expose what's happening here, it will keep happening. It will get worse." Xavier sat still for a moment, weighing Graham's words. A slow fury began to rise in his chest, not just for what Daniels had done, but for everything that had led to this moment. This town, his town, was a place where people like him had fought, bled, and built things, just to have them taken away with a few harsh words or a crooked look. He had spent his career trying to get out of the suffocating grasp of a system designed to keep him in place. "I don't have time for a crusade," Xavier muttered, his fingers tapping the edge of his coffee cup. "I've got a business to run, a community to take care of. This," he gestured around the diner, "this is small stuff." Charles didn't let up. His eyes were now more intense, his jaw tightening. "You've already fought a battle, Xavier, and you know better than anyone that this is far from small stuff. What Daniels did to you today, it's just the tip of the iceberg. You've been a target here since the day you started to matter. Now that you're making noise, people like Daniels feel threatened, and that makes them lash out." Xavier's hands clenched, and he fought the rising anger in his chest. It was true, he had seen it all his life. The way people feared him the moment he started succeeding, the looks, the whispers, the judgments. But Daniels had taken it too far. This wasn't just about a power trip or a simple mistake, this was personal. "I don't need saving," Xavier said, his tone sharp. "I've dealt with worse, but what's your angle, Graham? What do you want from me?" Graham leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to convey urgency. "I want you to take this seriously. You might think that you can play by the rules, but these people like Daniels, will never let you win unless you expose them. I'm offering you something bigger than just a fight against one cop. I'm offering you the chance to change the system." Xavier stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. The idea of shaking the very foundations of this town's power structure was tantalizing, but it also carried the weight of something much bigger. He would have to expose not just Daniels, but everyone who had ever contributed to the broken system. The risks were immense. The consequences could be life-altering. "I can't do this alone," Xavier said quietly, after a pause. "If you think I'm going to take on this entire town by myself, you're wrong." Charles smiled slightly, his eyes flickering with a hint of understanding. "You won't have to. I have allies, people who want to see change as much as you do. But it starts with you, Xavier. It starts with your decision to stand up and say enough is enough." The weight of those words hung in the air, making Xavier feel the full gravity of what Graham was suggesting. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of making money or securing his place at the top. This was about something far more personal. It was about fighting for the dignity of his people, for his own dignity, and for the generations that had come before him. The idea of taking down a system so deeply entrenched in racial bias was both exhilarating and terrifying. Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, Xavier!" He turned to see a familiar face. Mitchell, one of his old college friends, now working as a local journalist. Mitchell had always been sympathetic to Xavier's cause, though he had kept his distance when it came to taking any real action. Mitchell was hesitant but kind, caught between the desire for justice and the comfort of not rocking the boat. "What's going on here?" Mitchell asked, standing awkwardly by the table. Xavier sighed, looking from Mitchell to Graham. He knew that if anyone would understand what was at stake here, it would be Mitchell. But even he might hesitate to step too far into this fight. "Just talking," Xavier said, trying to keep his voice neutral. But Mitchell's eyes flicked between the two men. "Talking about what I heard the commotion outside that Daniels kid really gave you a hard time, huh?" Xavier didn't answer right away, but his eyes met Graham's. Charles saw the struggle in his face, the hesitance to make this public, to take it further. Xavier had always been the man who worked in the shadows, who used his influence quietly. But this was different. The weight of the moment hung heavy on him, and he realized that it had to be done. "Xavier, listen," Mitchell said, his voice low now. "I know you've been quiet about a lot of things, but this isn't something you can let slide. I've been seeing the way things are, the way this town treats people who don't look like them, and I know you've been walking the line, but maybe it's time for you to lead the charge." Xavier looked at Mitchell, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You really think I can change this place?" Mitchell didn't hesitate. "Yes. If anyone can, it's you." The words hung in the air as Xavier weighed them. This was his choice now. His path. But there was no turning back once he made it. "Okay," Xavier said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "I'm in." Graham nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Good. But we need to move quickly. Daniels is only the beginning. The real fight is about to begin." And with that, the tension in the room seemed to shift. Xavier Shaw had made his choice. The storm was coming, and the time for silence had ended. The stakes were higher than ever, and Xavier knew that the battle ahead would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. Xavier Shaw's hands clenched into fists as he stared down the empty street outside his office. He had seen how Officer Daniels, and others like him, worked their power, using it to manipulate and control those they deemed lesser. But what had happened to him, to his dignity, was the last straw he couldn't sit idly by anymore. The conversation with Charles Graham had lit a fire inside him. Graham wasn't just another lawyer looking to profit from another high-profile case. He was someone who understood the depths of the problem, someone who had seen the system at work from the inside out. But even as Xavier acknowledged this new ally, he couldn't help but feel a gnawing doubt. Was he really prepared to take on the entire system? His past success hadn't come from rocking the boat. It had come from navigating it, from using the currents to push himself ahead without causing too many waves. But now, it felt like the boat was sinking, and he had to choose whether to sink with it or try to swim. There was no going back. The ringing of his phone broke through his thoughts. It was Mitchell. He hadn't spoken to Mitchell much since their last conversation, but the journalist had been adamant that Xavier needed to act, that the town needed him to lead the charge. Xavier took a deep breath and answered. "Xavier, you still with me?" Mitchell's voice was urgent, an edge of worry in his tone. "Daniels is making moves, man. He's starting to gather his own allies. There's talk of a bigger crackdown, and it's not just you he's targeting. We're talking about the whole damn town." Xavier exhaled sharply. "What do you mean targeting the whole town?" "Everything you've been telling me about how it's rigged, about the corruption Daniels has the backing of some big players, it's bigger than him. If you stand up, they'll come for you, for anyone connected to you, and I know you've been quiet about it, but I think it's time to get loud." Xavier rubbed his temples, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I'm not sure how much louder I can get, Mitchell. I've already been humiliated. If I make a move now, it'll be open war. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everything I've built. I can't risk it." "I know you're trying to play it smart," Mitchell said, his voice steady now. "But think about it. How long can you stay in the shadows? How long before the very system that's suffocating you cracks down and breaks everything you've built? You've been quiet long enough, it's time to act." Xavier stood up, his mind swirling with the impossible weight of Mitchell's words. This wasn't just about him being a successful businessman. It wasn't about his wealth or reputation. It was about survival, his and everyone else's, who had been silenced by the power structures of the town. "I can't do this by myself," Xavier finally said, his voice firm. "But I'm not going down without a fight. We need to bring the fight to them." Mitchell let out a low chuckle. "That's what I like to hear. We've got your back, man." Xavier set his jaw and glanced at the window, watching as the sky began to darken, clouds gathering like the tension in his chest. It was time to stop running from what was inevitable. He had to face the people who thought they could control his fate, expose them, and make a stand, no matter what it cost him. Later that evening, Xavier sat across from Charles Graham at a local coffee shop, his face grim. They were in the heart of downtown, the very place where his ancestors had struggled to find a voice, and the place where the battle for his future would be fought. "We're at a crossroads," Graham said, his voice low but resolute. There's no turning back now. You want to fight the system. You need to expose the people pulling the strings. Daniels is just the tip of the iceberg. The people behind him, well, they've got power, they've got influence, and they don't take kindly to someone like you challenging them. Xavier didn't flinch. He wasn't intimidated anymore. I've spent my whole life dealing with people who want to see me fail. This isn't new for me. I know, Graham replied, his expression shifting. But you've also built something here. You've established a presence, that's why they're after you. You're a threat to the system. And now it's time to use that power, to take it from them, and make them see that they can't keep controlling everything. Xavier nodded, still processing everything that was unfolding around him. He had always prided himself on playing things by the book, on succeeding with integrity, and not fighting dirty. But the rules had changed. And if he wanted to take control of his future, he had to take on this fight head on. He couldn't let Daniels, or anyone else, keep making him the target. So, what's the plan? Xavier asked, his voice steady, but filled with the urgency of the moment. We need evidence, Graham said, leaning forward. Real evidence of what Daniels and his people are up to. We can't just rely on whispers and rumors, we need to catch them in the act. But you have to be ready for the fallout, this will get messy. Xavier looked around the coffee shop, where a few patrons sat quietly, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. He had come a long way from that small-town boy with big dreams. He had worked his ass off to get here, and now it felt like it might all come crashing down. But this time, he wasn't going to let them take it from him. I'm ready, he said, his resolve hardening with every word. Let's do this. The next few days passed in a blur of strategy and preparation. Xavier met with Mitchell and Graham regularly, gathering intel and setting up plans to expose the corruption that had festered for far too long. They began documenting everything they could, reaching out to the right people, securing sources, and putting pressure on anyone who might hold a key to the truth. But as they moved closer to uncovering the full scope of Daniels' involvement, the stakes grew higher. It wasn't just about exposing one officer anymore. It was about toppling a system of injustice that had controlled the town for generations. Xavier felt the pressure mounting, the weight of the fight pulling at his every thought. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't think about anything else. Every meeting, every conversation, every move they made brought them closer to the inevitable showdown. And yet, he still had doubts. Was it worth it? Was exposing the truth worth everything he had worked for? But every time doubt crept in, he thought about the people he was fighting for. The community that had been silenced. His ancestors, who had fought and died for the right to be heard. He couldn't back down now. That evening, just as Xavier was leaving his office, his phone rang again. It was Mitchell. Xavier, Mitchell said, urgency in his voice. We've got a problem. Daniels is making his move. He's going to publicly smear your name, and we're running out of time. Xavier's heart skipped a beat. What's he doing? He's digging up dirt. Anything he can use against you. I don't know how much longer we have before he makes a move. We need to hit him hard with the evidence we have now. The words hit Xavier like a punch to the gut. It was time. The hour had come. He could feel the tension in the pit of his stomach. It was no longer just about making a statement or exposing a corrupt cop. It was about survival, about showing everyone that he wasn't someone to be pushed around anymore. I'm on my way, Xavier said, his voice quiet, but filled with a sense of finality. He took one last look at his office before heading out into the night, the storm clouds hanging low in the sky. Xavier knew the next 48 hours would define everything. The tension was palpable. Every step he took toward the confrontation felt heavier than the last. It was coming to a head, and he had to be ready. As he headed toward the meeting with Graham and Mitchell, he could sense that this was the moment. This was when everything would either change or crumble under the weight of what they were about to do. The stakes were high, and Xavier knew that after tonight, there would be no turning back. Xavier Shaw stood in front of the courthouse, his hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. The moment of truth had arrived. He had done everything in his power to prepare for this moment, gathering evidence, building a coalition, and securing allies like Charles Graham and Mitchell. Yet, the weight of the situation was almost too much to bear. What if it all fell apart? What if this confrontation led to nothing but further humiliation? But Xavier's doubts didn't matter anymore. The stakes were too high. Officer Daniels and the corrupt network he represented had to be held accountable. This was no longer just about Xavier's reputation. It was about justice for the entire community. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Xavier from his thoughts. He turned and saw Graham and Mitchell walking toward him, their faces grim but resolute. They had all been preparing for this moment for weeks, but Xavier could sense the gravity of it now. He could feel the eyes of the town upon them. This was no longer just a personal battle. It was a fight for the future of Millbrooke, for everything the people here deserved but had been denied for so long. "We're ready," Graham said, his voice low. "Daniels is expecting us, and the media's already been tipped off." Xavier nodded. He'd been bracing for this, but the moment the words left Graham's mouth, a wave of urgency crashed over him. It was time to face Daniels. The three of them entered the courthouse, where the final showdown was to take place. They walked through the halls, passing other officers who had been a part of Daniels' network, giving them only a brief, hard look as they made their way to the main courtroom. The tension in the air was palpable. Something big was about to happen, and everyone knew it. Xavier's heart raced as he approached the door of the courtroom. The room was already crowded with reporters, officers, and a few onlookers who had come to witness what was going to unfold. He stepped inside, and immediately spotted Daniels standing at the front of the room, flanked by a few of his fellow officers. The look on Daniels' face made Xavier's blood run cold. There was a palpable sense of arrogance about him, as if he knew the outcome already. "Mr. Shaw," Daniels sneered as Xavier stepped forward. "I see you've brought your lawyer and your little band of supporters. You think this is going to change anything?" Xavier's gaze hardened as he stepped toward Daniels. He wasn't here to argue or defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. "No, Officer Daniels," Xavier said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about every person you've wronged, every person you've silenced, and it's about time you face the consequences of your actions." Daniels chuckled, clearly not taking Xavier seriously. "Consequences?" he said, turning to the room with a mocking laugh. "What consequences? You think some fancy lawyer is going to save you? This is my town, Shaw. You're just a guest here, and you always will be. You don't get to decide how things go." Xavier's fists clenched at his sides. He had heard enough. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a battle for everything he had fought for. "I'm not your guest, Daniels," Xavier said, his voice rising with a quiet fury. "I've lived here longer than you've had your badge. I've worked for every inch of success I have, while people like you have used your power to destroy anyone who stands in your way." Daniels took a step closer, his eyes narrowed in contempt. "You think your little history, your money, your success, matters. You think that changes the way things work around here. You're nothing but a token, Shaw. A black man in a suit with some nice things. You're just like the rest of them, thinking you can get away with whatever you want because of who you are." The words struck Xavier like a slap in the face, but instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath. Daniels had just exposed his true nature, his own prejudices, his arrogance, his complete disregard for anyone who wasn't like him. Xavier had known this man's type before. He wouldn't be swayed by Daniels' petty insults or his attempts to provoke him. Instead, Xavier stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with purpose. "It's not about who I am, Daniels. It's about what I'm willing to do for my community, and I'm not going to stand by and let you destroy everything we've worked for." As Xavier spoke, he could feel the weight of the room shift. People were starting to pay attention. They had seen the way Daniels treated him, but now they were beginning to see the depth of his corruption. Daniels scoffed, trying to regain control. "You can talk all you want, Shaw. But it's too late. I've already made my move. You've already lost." Xavier's gaze never wavered. "I haven't lost anything, Daniels. You have. You've lost your integrity, you've lost your honor, and soon, you'll lose everything you thought you had control over." The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Daniels was clearly rattled now, but his bravado remained. He turned to the reporters, a smug grin on his face. "I'll let you all see what happens when people like this think they can play by their own rules." Before Daniels could continue, Graham stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You're not just going to slander this man, Daniels. You're not going to get away with it anymore." Xavier felt a rush of gratitude toward Graham. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had allies, people who understood the importance of standing up, even when everything seemed stacked against them. But just as the room seemed to be on the brink of a breakthrough, a figure appeared at the door, and Xavier's heart dropped. It was Officer Harris, the one officer he had hoped would be there to back him up. "Enough, Daniels," Harris said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is over." Daniels whirled around, eyes blazing with fury. "What do you mean, over?" He was practically spitting now. "You're going to let him walk free after everything he's done?" Harris didn't flinch. "No, Daniels. This is about you and your actions. You've been exposed, and the truth is going to come out. Your time is up." Xavier felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone was willing to stand up to Daniels and his reign of terror. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. "You think you've won?" Daniels snapped, his eyes wild with rage. "This is just the beginning. I've got people in places you can't even imagine." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, but Xavier didn't flinch. He had been through worse, he had faced down systems that tried to crush him, and he wasn't about to back down now. "No, Daniels," Xavier said, his voice steady. "This is the beginning of the end for you." Just as he finished speaking, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and several officers entered. They were the ones who had been following the case from the beginning, ones who had quietly observed Daniels' behavior for years. They had seen the corruption, the lies, and the abuse of power. And now, they were ready to act. The tension in the room reached its peak. The officers walked toward Daniels, their expressions hard as stone. "You're done," one of them said, his voice filled with finality. Daniels, realizing he was outnumbered, turned to run. But before he could make it to the door, Harris stepped forward, blocking his path. "It's over," she said quietly. The room was silent, and in that silence, Xavier Shaw knew that the world was about to change. He had fought for his voice, for his dignity, and for the truth. And now, with Daniels exposed, and the system beginning to crumble, it was time for justice. But as the room began to settle, Xavier could feel the weight of what was to come. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The stakes had never been higher. And as Xavier watched Daniels being led out of the courtroom, he knew that everything he had fought for was about to ignite a movement that would challenge everything the town had ever known. Xavier Shaw's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood across from Officer Daniels. The room felt charged, as if it were about to explode at any moment. The tension was thick in the air, like a storm about to break. Xavier had known this confrontation would come. But now that it was here, every word, every action would carry unimaginable weight. Daniels stood with his arms crossed, his stance one of defiance. His expression was one of pure disdain. A man who felt completely untouchable, a man who had lived his whole life, convinced that his badge gave him the right to do anything. Xavier had seen this arrogance before. Those who believed the power of their position protected them from the consequences of their actions. But Xavier wasn't afraid. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything, huh?" Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't belong here, Shaw. You've never belonged. You're just another rich black man trying to act like you matter, but you don't." Xavier's eyes narrowed. The words stung, but he wasn't about to let Daniels see how much they hurt. He had fought too long and too hard to let a man like Daniels, who represented everything broken in this system, tear him down now. "You're right about one thing," Xavier said, his voice cold but steady. "I don't belong in your corrupt world. But I've worked for everything I have, and I've earned every ounce of respect. You, on the other hand, have earned nothing but contempt." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think I care about your fancy words, Shaw? You don't scare me." He took a step forward, and Xavier could see the volatility in his movements, the desperate need to assert his power. "You think you're different, but you're just another black man trying to get something for nothing. You don't deserve to be here, and I'm going to make sure the world sees that." Xavier stood his ground. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice rose slightly, not out of anger, but out of conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person you've ever belittled, every person you've humiliated because they didn't look like you, and you think it's just going to stay the same. You're wrong today. It ends today. You're exposed for what you really are." Daniels stepped closer, his face red with anger. Expose me. You think you can expose me? You don't know what you're up against. I have people in high places. You're nothing to me. Xavier didn't flinch. He had dealt with threats like this his whole life. He had stood in front of men who thought their power would intimidate him, and he had never backed down. It's you who doesn't understand, Daniels. You think you can just use your badge to make people afraid, you think you can control everything around you because you wear that uniform, but I'm not afraid of you, I'm not afraid of anyone who thinks they can break me down. The room felt colder as Daniels' eyes burned with fury. He moved closer still until their faces were inches apart. You think this is over? Daniels' voice was low, menacing. You're just getting started, Shaw. You're making a big mistake. A mistake you'll regret. Xavier remained unmoved. I'm not the one making mistakes here, you are. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Not with aggression, but with quiet power. You've been abusing your power for far too long, and now it's time for the truth to come out. Daniels snarled, his fist clenched at his side, but before he could react, a voice rang out from across the room. That's enough, Daniels! Everyone turned. Officer Harris stood in the doorway, her eyes locked on Daniels, with an authority that seemed to swallow up the room. Her presence was like a lightning bolt, sharp and electrifying. What's going on here? She demanded, her tone stern but controlled. She had arrived just in time to witness the showdown, her expression unreadable, but her posture unwavering. Daniels turned on her, his voice seething with anger. This is none of your business, Harris, stay out of it. But Harris wasn't backing down. I said that's enough. You're out of line, Daniels, step away from Shaw. Daniels sneered, not ready to back down. You think you can just walk in here and stop me? You don't get to decide what happens next. This is my town. Harris took a step closer, her gaze never leaving Daniels. No, Daniels. This is about what's right, and you've crossed a line. You're done. Xavier stood silently, watching the two of them. The way Harris was standing up to Daniels was everything Xavier had been hoping for. She wasn't just a bystander. She wasn't afraid to take action. And it made all the difference. Harris looked at Xavier, her expression softening for the first time. Mr. Shaw, she said quietly, I'm sorry for what happened here today. Daniels had no reason to treat you like that. Xavier nodded, his gaze still locked on Daniels, who was now visibly trembling, trying to hold on to whatever shred of control he thought he still had. Thank you, Officer Harris. But this isn't just about me. This is about everything Daniels represents, and it's about time someone stood up to him. The room fell silent. Everyone was waiting for Daniels' next move. His bravado had slipped, his mask of authority cracking under the weight of the truth. He knew he was losing. The room was no longer on his side. The crowd that had gathered around the courthouse had shifted, their murmurs growing louder in support of Xavier. Their eyes were no longer filled with fear, but with solidarity. Daniels' face twisted with rage. He looked around at the officers who had arrived with Harris, then at the growing crowd, then back at Xavier, his gaze filled with venom. You think you've won? You think you can just take me down like this? He spat. Xavier stepped forward again, his voice steady, each word cutting through the tension. No. Daniels. You've already lost. You're not just losing your job. You're losing everything you've built on lies and abuse. This is bigger than me. Bigger than you. This is about every person you've ever hurt. Every time you used your power to break someone, to destroy them, and get away with it, but not anymore. You're done. Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the door behind him swung open, and more officers flooded into the room. They had been waiting for this moment. The atmosphere in the courthouse had shifted from one of fear to one of accountability. The officers who entered the room weren't just there to maintain order, they were there to make sure justice was served. One of them, a senior officer, stepped forward. Daniels, we need to talk now. Xavier didn't say anything, he just watched as Daniels was surrounded, his face pale with rage. The tension was palpable, the room heavy with the weight of everything that had led up to this point. Daniels had always thought he could control the situation. But now, he was completely powerless. Harris stepped closer to Xavier, her voice low. We've got him, Mr. Shaw. It's over. Xavier took a deep breath, but his heart was still racing. He had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. The battle for justice, for equality, for a better future, it was only just beginning. But as the officers moved to arrest Daniels, something shifted. The crowd that had gathered outside was no longer just an audience. They were part of this movement. They had stood up to the injustice they had witnessed, and now they were watching as Daniels was held accountable for his actions. Xavier turned to Harris, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about him, it's about everything he represents. This is a turning point for Millbrooke." Harris nodded, her expression filled with quiet determination. "You're right, Shaw. And we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." Xavier took one last look at Daniels as he was led away in handcuffs. The fight wasn't over yet. There were still battles to be fought, but for the first time, Xavier could see the possibility of change. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but today was a victory, and he would keep fighting. For himself, for the community, and for every person who had ever been made to feel less than they were. The room began to clear, and the crowd slowly dissipated. But the energy that had filled the space lingered. It was a new day for Millbrooke, and for the first time in a long time, Xavier believed that change was possible. The arrest of Officer Daniels was only the beginning. Xavier Shaw, his pulse still racing from the intensity of the moment, found himself surrounded by a new kind of energy. The courthouse that had felt so heavy with prejudice just hours before, now pulsed with the weight of collective resolve. His victory had come not through violence, but through unity, through the collective voices of the community standing together. But even as Daniels was led away in handcuffs, Xavier knew this fight wasn't over. The crowd outside, which had started as a small gathering, had now grown larger. People had heard about the altercation, and word had spread quickly. The situation had escalated beyond a simple case of police brutality into something that demanded more, something that had the power to shake the very foundations of Millbrooke. Xavier stood at the entrance of the courthouse, watching the officers escort Daniels to a squad car. There was no triumphant feeling in his chest, no rush of victory. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction that filled him. The injustice he'd witnessed, the same injustice so many people of color had experienced in this town, had been exposed. But the weight of his actions also carried a responsibility. "Mr. Shaw." Xavier turned to see Chief Reynolds approaching, his face still set in a grim expression. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did here today," the chief said, his voice low. "I know this isn't just about you, and I'm aware that this situation goes deeper than one officer's actions. Daniels will face the consequences for what he did. But it's going to take all of us to make sure nothing like this happens again." Xavier nodded, a small flicker of respect for the chief passing through him. "I appreciate that, Chief. But this town needs more than just a few consequences for one man. It needs change, real change." He turned his gaze back to the crowd, his mind already turning to the next steps. The chief followed his line of sight, his expression darkening slightly. "We know that. And that's why we're going to have a meeting tomorrow. We'll have community leaders, activists, and officers all in the same room. We're not going to let this go unnoticed." Xavier could feel the tension in his body slowly beginning to ease. He had hoped for this, but now that it was here, he knew it wasn't enough. The truth had come to light, but it wasn't a guarantee that things would change. The battle for justice was long, and even though today was a victory, there would be more hurdles ahead. As the crowd around the courthouse began to thin, Xavier found himself walking away from the scene with Harris and Mitchell, who had stuck by his side throughout the ordeal. "Are you okay?" Mitchell asked, his voice concerned. As they moved through the parking lot, Xavier could see the questions in Mitchell's eyes, the mix of admiration and guilt. "You were amazing in there. You stood up to Daniels like it was nothing, but it's not over, right?" Xavier finished for him. "No, it's not. This isn't just about me, it's about every person who's ever been treated this way." He stopped, glancing back toward the courthouse. "The community's support means everything, but we can't let it stop here. We need to keep pushing. This is just one battle, not the war." Harris, who had been silent up until now, nodded. "You're right. This town has been operating with these prejudices for far too long. People like Daniels, they don't just disappear, they're the product of a system, not the cause." Xavier smiled faintly, grateful for Harris's insight. "Exactly. And that system is what we need to dismantle. We need to hold the right people accountable, not just the ones who act out in front of a crowd. I'm tired of being the exception." He shook his head. "I'm tired of being the one who has to prove my worth every damn day." Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. "I get it. But you're not alone in this. Not anymore." Xavier's mind raced as he walked to his car. He had seen this type of thing happen before. Protests, demands for justice, promises for reform. But promises could only go so far. He had seen how quickly things could fall apart. People would forget the names of the victims, the promises of change would fade, and the system would continue to grind along as it always had. This time, however, something was different. He had seen the power of unity firsthand. People were speaking up. They were standing together. And that was the most powerful weapon they had. The next few days were a whirlwind. The town was alive with conversation, with protests, with town hall meetings. For the first time, the community had been forced to confront its prejudices head-on. People who had once been silent were now speaking out, demanding answers, calling for accountability. The mayor's office was flooded with phone calls. The police department's reputation, once a shield for officers like Daniels, was now in jeopardy. At the center of it all was Xavier, a man who had once tried to avoid the spotlight, now thrust into the role of a leader. It wasn't easy. He had to balance his own business with the work of reform. He had to navigate the delicate politics of Millbrooke's power structure, while keeping a watchful eye on the progress being made. The meetings were long and difficult, with some local officials still resisting change, still clinging to the status quo. But there were others who were ready for change, who understood the gravity of the situation, and were committed to seeing it through. Xavier had learned, over the years, to play the game. He had built his business from the ground up, overcoming barriers and prejudice along the way. But now, he was fighting for something much larger than himself. He was fighting for a community that had been ignored, mistreated, and oppressed for generations. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but he refused to back down. The following week, Xavier found himself sitting in a room with the mayor, several community leaders, and members of the police department. The room was tense, the air thick with the kind of anxiety that comes before a storm. But Xavier knew that if they were going to make real change, they had to speak truth to power, even when it was uncomfortable. "This isn't just about one officer," Xavier began, his voice steady, his words carefully chosen. "This is about a system that's been broken for far too long. It's about the way people of color are treated differently in this town. It's about the fact that, for years, we've been told we don't matter." He glanced around the room, locking eyes with the mayor, who had been silent up until this point. "We need to put measures in place to hold these officers accountable. We need community oversight, transparency, and real consequences for actions like what we saw last week. It's not enough to say you're going to change, you need to show us." The mayor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand what you're saying, Mr. Shaw, but this town's been—" Xavier cut him off. "This town has been broken for too long, and you can't keep pretending it's not. We need a change that's not just on paper, but in action. It's time to listen to the people who live here." The room was silent for a moment. The mayor shifted in his seat, clearly not used to being challenged in such a direct way. But Xavier's words were powerful, cutting through the hesitation and resistance that had held Millbrooke back for so long. The people of Millbrooke had waited too long for change, and now, it was time for them to demand it. As the meeting came to a close, there was a palpable shift in the room. There were no immediate solutions, no promises of overnight change. But something had begun to crack. People were starting to listen. The weight of Xavier's words had done what the protests, the marches, and the petitions had not been able to do. For the first time in years, the town was facing its own reflection. It wasn't a perfect reflection, but it was a start. Xavier walked out of the room, his mind still processing everything that had transpired. His fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as he walked through the crowded streets of Millbrooke, a sense of quiet hope began to settle in. The people were ready, and together, they would take on whatever came next. He had fought for respect before, first in the corporate world, and now in his own hometown. But this time, it wasn't just for him. It was for the entire community. And for the first time in a long time, Xavier felt like change was possible. But the road ahead was still long. There would be more battles to fight, more resistance to overcome, but Xavier Shaw was ready. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across Millbrooke, as Xavier Shaw stood on the steps of his office building. He took a deep breath, the crisp evening air filling his lungs, grounding him in the present. The tension of the past weeks, the protests, the struggles, the meetings, had not left him, but they had evolved. What had started as a battle for his own dignity had become a movement, a call for justice that echoed across the town, reverberating in every corner where inequality had taken root. Today, the fight was not just his. It belonged to every person who had ever been overlooked, silenced, or marginalized. It was a fight for change that he had begun, and that his community would continue long after the dust settled. Xavier's journey had not been an easy one. When he had returned to Millbrooke years ago, he had hoped to create a safe, successful space for his family and his business. What he hadn't anticipated was that the town, his hometown, still carried the weight of its old prejudices, steeped in a legacy of systemic injustice. But what had been a quiet hope for peace had grown into a resounding call for action. The injustice he had faced, an accusation of betrayal, a standoff with corrupt forces, and an attempt to silence him, had only hardened his resolve. It had all started innocently enough. The young cop, Officer Daniels, had treated him like a common criminal, based on his appearance alone. Yet from that moment, it was clear that Xavier was more than capable of facing down the obstacles in his path. His quiet dignity and wisdom had been enough to withstand Daniels' disrespect, and in time, his courage had inspired others to do the same. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had sparked something in the town. The once silent witnesses had begun to raise their voices. The crowd that had gathered that fateful afternoon had become more than a gathering. They were a force of change, united by a common cause. As Daniels was escorted away that day, there had been no sense of victory, only the first steps toward long-term transformation. Xavier knew that this incident, though pivotal, was not an isolated one. It had exposed a far deeper issue that had festered in the town for generations: the implicit and explicit biases that shaped how Black people were viewed, treated, and judged. It was a microcosm of the broader issue of systemic racism that plagued the entire country. From Daniel's small-town biases to the larger institutions that perpetuated inequality, Xavier knew that the work was far from over. In the days that followed, the town had been forced to face the uncomfortable truths about its past. At the heart of it all, Xavier had become an unlikely leader, someone who had not sought the role but had risen to meet it. What started with an altercation with one racist officer had led to town hall meetings, protests, and discussions that finally brought those in power to the table. With the help of allies, including Sergeant Harris, Chief Reynolds, and Mitchell, Xavier had been able to force the system to look at itself in the mirror. He had become a voice for the voiceless, someone who demanded action, not just words. But even as Daniels was removed from the police force, Xavier knew that this victory was only the beginning. The systems of power were slow to change, and the struggles of the marginalized weren't solved with a single confrontation. He knew that the challenges would continue. It was no longer just about getting justice for the few. It was about ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. The true measure of success would be in how the town, and ultimately, the system, was restructured to prevent further injustice. He stood now in the midst of those changes. The meetings that followed had started to yield results. A proposal for independent oversight of the police department was being considered, and there were discussions about increasing funding for community organizations that provided support to marginalized groups. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but the foundation had been laid. The people of Millbrooke had seen the truth in Xavier's words, and they were ready to act. Yet despite the progress, Xavier couldn't ignore the moments of doubt that lingered. Every time he passed a newsstand or tuned into a conversation about law enforcement, the problem seemed insurmountable. The injustices ran so deep, and the system had so many ways to protect itself, to shield itself from accountability. As much as he wanted to believe that the storm had passed, Xavier understood the ongoing need for vigilance. The fight for true justice wasn't just about exposing wrongs. It was about creating sustainable change that would prevent future injustices. Xavier's mind often wandered back to the people who had been with him through it all. The faces of those who had supported him during the protests, the community leaders who had backed his calls for reform, the activists who had carried the torch long before he arrived, they were the unsung heroes of this story. While he had been the public face of the movement, they had been its backbone, driving it forward in the quiet moments when no one was watching. Through it all, Xavier had learned the true power of collective action. He had seen how the voice of one could be drowned out by the system, but the voice of many could not be ignored. It was in the faces of the people who had rallied behind him that he had found his strength. It was in their collective courage that he had seen the true power of resilience. He knew that the road to change would continue to be long, and the sacrifices would still be great. But Xavier wasn't alone anymore. He had seen firsthand what was possible when people came together, when they found common cause in the face of injustice. The power of the people, united, had been a lesson Xavier would never forget. In the coming months, as Xavier continued to speak out for reform and support those who had fought alongside him, he began to see the broader impact of his actions. More businesses opened their doors to diversity initiatives. More local organizations began speaking about racial equity. The national conversation on systemic racism continued to grow, and Millbrooke was no longer a quiet town. It was a town at the heart of change. And for Xavier, the journey had only just begun. His work had already sparked a conversation that was forcing people to look at the way they lived, the assumptions they made, and the systems they took for granted. But this wasn't just about fighting for fairness in the small town of Millbrooke. This was about addressing the larger battle that spanned the country. Fighting for equality, fighting for justice, and fighting for a future where no one would ever have to fight for their basic human dignity. The weight of it all had settled into Xavier's bones, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a calling. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first arrived in Millbrooke. The events had shaped him, hardened his resolve, and deepened his commitment to fighting for what was right. As he stood there in the fading light, watching the sunset over Millbrooke, Xavier realized something. This was his home. And just as he had returned to rebuild his business, he would continue to fight for this town, for the people who called it home, for the ones who had been silenced for so long. The fight wasn't over, it might never be over, but with every step forward, every voice raised in unity, and every act of defiance against the systems that sought to oppress them, Xavier Shaw knew that change was possible, and that, in itself, was enough to keep moving forward. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was the story of every person who had ever been silenced. And as long as there was breath in his body, Xavier would fight to make sure their voices were heard, their rights protected, and their dignity upheld.